Han Solo is the comic that should have been in Heroes for a New Hope, the hardcover anthology that collected the Princess Leia, Lando and Chewie comics. And just like those three, Han Solo is a 5-issue story that takes place immediately after A New Hope. It also includes issues 8 to 12, the main Star Wars comic, which is the second trade and collects the entire Showdown on Smuggler's Moon arc, but since that was collected in the Star Wars Volume 1 hardcover, and I've already reviewed that on my channel, I won't review it here, although I will quickly flip through it so you can see it. All I will say about it though is that if it hadn't been included along with the Han Solo comic, this would probably have been one of those shitty hardcovers Marvel releases like Shattered Empire and Captain Phasma, where they usually only collect 4 or 5 issues and it doesn't come with a dust jacket. This does come with a dust jacket, so it's probably because of how thick it is, so even though I think having the Star Wars comics in here is pointless because it doesn't flow, I'm glad they are because I'll get a dust jacket rather than just shitty boards. When you take the dust jacket off, it has the typical wraparound image, and this time it's a cool image of Falcon during the race trying to escape being destroyed. The story starts with Han after the Battle of Yavin taking on smuggling jobs, but being more careful than ever about who he works for and what the cargo is. The reason for this is paranoia. After the part he played in the Battle of Yavin and the events on the Death Star, he's paranoid that one of the jobs will be a trap laid out by the Empire. I thought it was a good trait to give Han in spite of the fact that we don't see it in the movies, because Han has street smarts and we know Han would be worried about the Empire after helping to blow up the Death Star, and it's all dealt with in this comic, which apart from the fact that the movies came out way before the comic, explains why we don't see it in the movies. Han's paranoia is justified when he recognises someone in a bar from an entirely different planet, and the chances of seeing the same person on 2 planets in a row is astronomical, so he hightails it out of there, but they catch him, and it turns out they have a message from Princess Leia. She wants to borrow his ship. I thought it was pretty funny because we know Han wouldn't let anyone except Chewie and Lando fly the Falcon, and he reacts about as much as you'd expect him to, with him just saying goodbye and starts walking away. I think that's 100% accurate and something he would do in the movie, so I thought that was well written. After Chewie vouches for the strangers and Han sees the message, Han heads back to Yavin to see her worshipfulness, where she informs him of a secret group of rebel spies placed on different planets that completed their intelligence mission and need to be extracted, and it needs to be done quickly because they're starting to be murdered. Now, one of the things mentioned here, and it's important, is that only Princess Leia and this general who's with her know the names of all the spies, but later on it's revealed that one of the spies managed to find out who the other spies were? Maybe I'm just being stupid, but it didn't make sense to me because none of the spies reported to each other, as well as the fact that it's revealed that there's an extra spy that does have a list of all their names, but that spy turns out not to be the traitor, so I just don't understand how one of the spies got the names of all the other spies. Makes no sense to me at all, not to mention the fact that Leia and this general aren't the only ones who know their names, and they knew that at the time, but they stated they were. It's a gaping plot hole. But anyway, Leia informs Han about the Dragon Void run, a race in space for the best of the best of the best pilots in the galaxy, and it conveniently happens to run along the planets the extraction points are for the spies, so she wants Han to do the run, pick up the spies and get them back to base. Han reluctantly agrees and heads out, but Leia says he can't just leave because the spy they're looking for might be on the base, instead of out there killing the other spies. None of it makes sense. Either way, it leads to the funniest moment in the book where Han is trying to seduce her like he did in Empire, and Leia slaps him, shouting that he should leave and never come back, giving Han the reason to leave the base without the spy having any reason to watch him. It was a good bit of writing, directly relevant to the story, funny, and played right into how we see these two interact in the movies, so Lou did a good job there. And this is how the comic really begins, with Han entering the race and a clear goal in mind. He goes to the race arena, which looks like Deep Space Nine, but to be fair, they all do these days, and he mixes with the other racers being laughed at for not being a true racer and just being a smuggler. These people laughing at him would eventually become his allies in his mission throughout the race, but they don't stop ridiculing him until someone called Lu Ray Anno appears and stops them. Lurey Anno is an interesting character. Visually, she looks like Azora from Ocarina of Time or Twilight Princess, but taller and thinner, and she seems to be ancient, part of a race that built maps for hyperspace routes long before the Republic existed. So they're similar to the ancients in Stargate, and the comparison to them in Legends would be the Infinite's Rakatan Empire, which you may remember from the Dawn of the Jedi comics, but more famously for being the species that created the Starforge in the first Knights of the Old Republic game. This isn't the only similarity to Stargate, because the gate itself actually transports things to another dimension, and the gate was built by Lurey Anno's people thousands of years ago for their exodus, so presumably they left this dimension behind and never came back. And I find this interesting because in Stargate the ancients never really came back. They kind of evolved but didn't interfere with human affairs, they just dropped to Stargate and moved on. There were a couple that intervened when they shouldn't have, but mostly they just left. The other reason this is interesting is because of the trailer for the second season of Resistance, which is an awful show, by the way, but there's one shot in that trailer where we can see one of Lurey Anno's species, so I wonder if they came back at some point or will come back in the series. Given that Lurey Anno is a racer and the show follows racers, it makes sense for them to include her race if they can write them in properly. I'm not holding my breath on that one. At the end of the book, the gate is opened and some of Lurey Anno's people come through, so it could be that they're here permanently now, but it's not made clear. We don't see them again after the gate opens, so I'm curious, mildly curious, but not expecting much. So the book goes through Han picking up all the spies on the run, dealing with both the racers and the Empire, and if you don't care about giant plot holes, then it's all very enjoyable. I do care about plot holes. What's the point of reading a story if it makes no sense? So it all seemed pointless to me since it was all flawed, but it definitely got the feel of Star Wars down. I'll give Lou credit for that. Han feels like Han, especially the way he talks to his ship, the arrogant Empire officer, the good mix of alien species like dogs, Twi'leks, and even some of the cat people from the Han Solo trilogy in Legends appear, making this the second time they've been in the new canon since Charles Soule included them in his Lando comic. That's the good Lando comic, by the way, not the racist piece of shit we got from Rodney Barnes that introduced the world to a disco dancing jive talking Lando. At some point Han says he only knows space because he's lived there most of his life? But in the Solo movie, which people think is set about 10 years before A New Hope, we know he spent about the first 20 years of his life living underground on Corellia, and Most Wanted was set only a year or two before the Solo movie, so he spent 2/3 of his life underground, never leaving the planet, and 1/3 of it in space. This isn't an issue with the comic itself, it's an issue with Pablo Hidalgo and the story group. This was released as individual comics between June and November in 2016, 2 whole years before Solo was released and probably hadn't even been thought of at this point. Paperback came out in January 2017, more than a year before Solo was released, and the hardcover was released 10 days before the Solo movie, so the story group had plenty of time to write Solo and Most Wanted so it didn't contradict this comic. But they didn't, because they're shit at their jobs. They don't care, they care about money, not stories, not lore, not world building, money. The only reason they're pushing the social justice warrior politics is because they believe there are more social justice warriors than there are regular people, and they believe advertising to them in this way will net them more money than they'll get from regular people. They're wrong, but that's why they cater to social justice warriors. It's all about the money, not the politics. They just use the politics to make more money. That's it. Defenders will hail Hidalgo and Johnson as the best thing to ever happen to Star Wars, and the reality is these people are fucking retards. One's all but been confirmed to have his trilogy cancelled. The other had to lock his Twitter account to private. How badly do you have to fuck up writing Star Wars to do either of those things? I ask it in every video and I'm going to ask it again. Why has someone allowed Solo to go ahead the way it has if they knew it was contradicting this comic? Disney said everything would be canon, and what they've done yet again is release something that contradicts their own stories. Why? If they didn't know this was being contradicted by Solo, then someone who was supposed to be checking for lore and history should have spotted it. Hidalgo. And if nobody is checking this stuff, why not? How are people supposed to immerse themselves in a universe as rich as Star Wars if creators can't keep things straight? What makes it worse is the creators themselves bitching on Twitter. I've lost count of how many people do it. We all know they do it. The two that stand out most to me, apart from Rian Johnson, who just doesn't respond to stuff like that anymore, are Hidalgo and some loser called Matt Martin, and they always say the same thing. Bear in mind, their jobs are to create lore and stories and make sure everything matches up. That's their jobs. Nothing more, nothing less. That's at least how I understand it. Pablo changes his mind on what his actual job is, but he gets credit for it. If he gets credit for it, it's his job. They always say the same thing. I'm sick and tired of being asked, is this canon, is that canon, so I'm not going to answer it anymore. That's not what I'm here for. But the sad fact is, if they had a clue what they were doing, had a proper timeline, and had people checking lore and events in the Star Wars universe, 99% of those questions wouldn't have been asked. They're only asked because of the amount of contradictory content coming from the Disney camp, and the people responsible, like Hidalgo, like Martin, are happy to take all the credit, then act like a victim when people ask questions. People who have paid money, I might add. People like me. When something doesn't make sense, am I not allowed to ask the author? Of course I am. The author doesn't have to answer, they don't have to reply at all, but I'm allowed to ask. Stop acting like a victim because you can't do your fucking job properly. The most recent example of contradictory lore is The Last Jedi and everything that's been retconned in it since. We know in that movie Luke did not train Rey, in fact he flat out refused to, but now we're getting comics telling us he did. And it's being inserted into books like Black Spire to try to fix it. But if they had a clue, made a proper long-term plan, and got it right first time, there would be no contradictory lore. But because there is, people ask. Then people like Hidalgo and Martin act like victims. If they did their fucking jobs properly in the first place, people wouldn't need to come to them with questions. It's their own fault. Maybe they should get their fat asses off of Twitter and start doing their fucking jobs properly. That way, everybody would be a lot happier. It's pathetic behaviour, and fans deserve a better Star Wars and a better creative team. Hell, I could pick 5 members, 5 of the Fandom Menace, and do a better job than Hidalgo and his story group. If we could do it, and we're not even getting paid, why can't they? They're getting paid, they have the resources. I'm paying to read this crap, and I'm doing a better job than they are. What the fuck? The funny thing is, in so many of my reviews, I've come up with alternate ways that would make things that have happened in a book or comic so they wouldn't have contradicted anything else, and I'm doing it for free. These people are paid to do it, and they still can't get it right. I don't know why Disney doesn't just hire actual fans to run the creative side of Star Wars, rather than people who have no interest or knowledge in the franchise and have incredibly poor organisational skills, because trust me, poor organisational skills is the issue here. Nobody has a database where they can check this and this and this. Nothing's organised, nothing's logged, so people just make stuff up. The guy in charge of looking after that lore has no database, he doesn't know what he's doing. Individual authors who don't connect with each other don't know what they're doing. Nobody knows what they're fucking doing. These fuckers couldn't organise a piss up in a fucking brewery. So... back to the comic. The story is good and enjoyable, but ultimately worthless because of that giant plot hole, where some people do know, some people don't know the names of all the spies, and it's just nonsense. And the lore is 50-50. I like Luriano's race and the potential they have for the future, but that's automatically a downer for me, since we know they won't give the character or the race anything important, notable, or logical. They'll just be another race, and that's that. I liked the Han lore. There's nothing wrong with saying Han spent most of his life in space, and I think Marjorie Liu got Han's character perfectly. It's just a shame people like Hidalgo have let this comic down retroactively by overwriting it with Solo. In terms of art, there's some really good use of digital art here. I'm not a massive fan. I like it. It can be good. But in an age where people have got so used to digital art being normal, sometimes, in fact quite often, I find the art lazy. It's quick, it's easy, it's cheap. More often than not, it's nasty. And it's easy for artists to really not put any effort in. It's just lazy. But there are a couple of moments in the comic that I thought had really good art. There's a few scenes where Han and Chewie are in a crowded place, like the bar at the beginning or the introduction meeting to the race, and it looks really busy. The artists haven't just drawn 5 people dotted around, there's people everywhere, and it looks really crowded. It actually looks more crowded than the club at the beginning of Attack of the Clones, and they're not all humans either. There's all sorts of aliens and skin colours going on, and the variety makes it look really nice. I also like the space scenes, which is good seeing as most of it's set in space. The ships look good, and I quite like the drawings of the Falcon. In particular, there's a lot of dirt and scorch marks on it that show just what a hunk of junk it is. And the Falcon is drawn in some really cool manoeuvres, like at the end when Han overtakes other ships, or when the ship jumps out of light speed into some interesting situations. But my favourite part of the art was Princess Leia. She's barely in it, but she wears this white costume that actually looks like silk or satin or something, and it comes across as very white, but if you look closely there's some very subtle shades of blues and greens, I think purples too, that just help to show off the white that much more while also acting as reflections of light around her. But it's so subtle you might not even notice it, but I thought it was really good. That and the scene where she slaps Han, because that's just funny. So overall, I mildly enjoyed the comic, but I think there's just too much negative here. What Lou got right, she definitely got right. It's just a shame people like Hidalgo and Martin have no clue what they're doing and have retroactively diminished the value of the story. Add that to the fact that Disney are now just flat out of ideas and allowed Johnson to write them into a corner, and I wouldn't be surprised if Lou Rayano's species is the Deus Ex that gives the Resistance the edge they need to beat the First Order in Rise of Skywalker. After all, they are an ancient and technologically advanced race, well beyond anything the Star Wars galaxy has at the moment, and I don't think it's a coincidence that this race has been brought back into the story in Resistance after absolutely nobody did anything with them since this comic was released. What, 2 years ago? 3 years ago? It's also nice that there's a bit of the main Star Wars comic in here, but it doesn't flow at all, so it's pointless. So I have mixed feelings about this book, as I do about a lot of Disney Star Wars. It's good if you like on the surface stuff or don't care about continuity. It's average if you do.